I'm Caitlin. I'm the speech therapist. I have met the vast majority of you at least once, if not multiple times. And Adam asked if I could give you guys a training on the IDDSSI diet textures, just so you can make sure everyone's on the same page and everyone knows what we're looking at. So, the IDDSSI diet is the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative. And why the heck is it important? So there are a few different reasons why a resident might be on a modified texture. Their food, their liquid, both, including dysphagia, lacking dentition, changes in cognition, medical procedures that they're preparing for, or just preference. Dysphagia and dentition are probably the two biggest ones for the folks in our building, so we'll go into dysphagia a little bit more, just so you guys know. So dysphagia
Swallowing,
is just,
or deglutition, is the process by which food passes from the mouth through the pharynx and into the esophagus.
Fair enough. So dysphagia is just an umbrella term that means difficulty swallowing, and your swallow is divided into 3 phases: oral, pharyngeal, and esophageal. And dysphagia can affect any of those phases, all of those phases, or some combination. So it varies widely from person to person, which is why we get such a range in our different modified textures. Regardless, most people are on modified textures because it's for their safety. They have some deficit in their swallow where they're unsafe to swallow regular food or regular thin liquids. So introducing IDDSSI. IDDSSI is just a diet texture framework used in healthcare settings across the globe. It's becoming more and more common, and it's got 2 main goals. It's just meant to give standardized, specific descriptive terms to different diet textures, and it's meant to give reliable ways of testing those textures to make sure they are correct and they're what they're supposed to be. We used to use the National Dysphagia Diet. We still have terms from this diet floating around, especially for liquids, so we're going to have them side by side, so it's good to be familiar with them and kind of know how the 2 systems compare. So we'll go into it. So this should look familiar to you. We see this chart all over the place. These are your IDDSSI diet texture levels and consistency levels. So liquids are generally measured between levels 0 and 4, and then solids are textures 3 through 7. You will notice that there's some overlap between 3 and 4. The only difference here, because they end at a similar texture, is where they're starting. You're either taking a liquid and thickening it up to a puree or an extremely thick or a moderately thick, or you're taking a food and you are pureeing it down or liquidizing it down. They're ending in the same place, but they're starting in different places. That's why that overlap is there. So our older terms, I will pull up here, regular, what used to be regular, we now have divided between regular and easy to chew. What we used to be called mechanical soft, which was very non-specific. People going, oh, mechanical soft, what the heck does that look like? So they had it mechanical soft chopped and mechanical soft ground. Now we have soft and bite-sized and minced and moist, which is much more specific, much more descriptive. Puree stayed pureed, and liquid stayed liquid. The biggest change on our textures was mechanical soft into those 2 levels that we now have. Liquids was the biggest change in terminology. Pudding thick is now extremely thick. Honey thick is now moderately thick. Nectar is now mildly thick. IDDSSI added a level to our textures called slightly thick. This was not included in the previous system. It's pretty much your level between thin liquids and nectar thick liquids. And then thin stayed thin. So mechanical soft got divided into 2 groups for textures, and nectar thick got divided into 2 levels for liquids. There's different ways of testing your textures and your consistencies. There's a flow test for liquids. You can test it with a fork, a spoon tilt, pressure, separation, and we'll go through them. So an IDDSSI funnel is technically how you measure liquid consistencies. We don't have an IDDSSI funnel, but I still want you guys to know what it is and to kind of know what the different thicknesses look like. So the goal of an IDDSSI funnel is to put 10 milliliters of liquid in a funnel, and after 10 seconds, you see how much remains in the funnel after it's poured out. And it looks like this. You just plug it with your finger, you put in your liquid, you let it fall out for 10 seconds, and you read how much is left. Fork drip test is you see if things sit on top of the fork, if they drip through the prongs of a fork, and how fast. You can see if things slip off a spoon, if you tilt that spoon, if they fall off, if they leave a bunch of residue behind. If you press a fork or a spoon onto the food, does it squish? Does it maintain its texture, or does the texture remain squished once you remove the utensil? And can you cut it with the side of a fork or a spoon if you were to flip it vertical? Those are our these four most relevant testing methods that we can realistically use in our day-to-day and in our kitchen, in our setting. So we will apply these to the IDDSSI levels. We're gonna start with just bottom, work our way up, 0 to 7. Thin liquids. We all know thin liquids. It's untouched by any thickener. It flows like water. You can drink it through anything. You'll be able to drink it from a cup, a straw, a bottle nipple, any of those things, thin can go through. Thin water. And if you were using the flow test, there would be less than 1 milliliter of liquid remaining in that funnel after 10 seconds, so it's pretty quickly moving. Slightly thick is our new level. It's slightly thicker than water, shocker. It requires just a little bit more effort. You can still get it through a straw, you can still get it through a bottle nipple. It's that step between thin and nectar. And an example would be something like tomato juice, where it's still very thin, it's just that tiny, tiny bit of thickness left, but you can still very easily drink it through just about anything. So there's your tomato juice, and there would be 1 to 4 milliliters left in your funnel after 10 seconds. Nectar is one we're familiar with. It's now called mildly thick. It flows off a spoon. It's sippable, again, slower than thin. Mild effort is required to drink this through a standard sized straw like we use. It would be something like fruit nectar if you've ever had some, or something like eggnog, especially store-bought eggnogs are kind of that right consistency. There's your picture. And there's 4 to 8 milliliters remaining in your funnel after 10 seconds. So if you keep in mind water versus tomato juice versus eggnog, it can kind of give you a good visual on those first 3. Moderately thick, we used to be called honey. You start getting your overlap here. If you were doing a food for this level, you would be liquidizing your food down to be this consistency. So you're thickening your liquid up to a honey texture or liquidizing your food down. It can be drunk from a cup. Moderate effort is required to get it through a standard straw. A lot of people would prefer to drink this one just because it's effortful to get through a straw, but you can totally do it. You can eat it with a spoon, but not with a fork. It will not stay on a fork. It cannot be piped or layered. If you tried to pipe it into a bowl like you would a mousse, it will lose its shape. No oral processing or chewing is required for this. So if you're liquidizing food down, they should not have to use any oral skill to swallow this. They can swallow it directly down. And it's completely smooth, no bits, no lumps, no pieces, nothing. At least or more than 8 milliliters remaining. It would drip through the prongs of a fork. You can't eat it with a fork because it would do this. If you took a fork and smushed it across the top or dragged it across the top, it would not leave that fork track pattern in the top. And it easily pours off a spoon with very little to no residue left behind. And you shouldn't have to really shake that spoon at all to get it off. It should just pour right off. Here's your difference. We'll pull this up. This is the funnel test for,
Most people
Did Maple Springs not give you YouTube Premium?
no. So, well, I also didn't look. I didn't ask. So this is just the flow test for levels 1, 2, and 3 for slightly, mildly, and moderately thick liquid.
Sounds so off.
Yeah, you don't need the sound for this one. I want you guys to see how it moves, even if you're not using this particular flow test. So watch how it moves out from underneath the bottom of the funnel. So by the time you're getting up to level 3 and you're looking at honey, it should be able to move through that, but it's a drip. It's not a flow. And that's how much you have left at the end of your 10 seconds for each one. So there's sort of your visual. Then you get into level 4. You cannot do a flow test with puree. It won't work, which is why it's not included in that comparison. So again, you're thickening liquid up to a pudding consistency or you're pureeing food down. You can eat it with a spoon, a fork is possible. It takes a little more effort, but it's possible. You cannot drink this from a cup. You cannot pull this through a straw. You have to eat this with a spoon or a fork if you're good. It does not require chewing. It can be piped and will retain its shape. If you attempted to pour it, it wouldn't really pour. It would eventually slide out. It moves under gravity, but can't be poured. It falls off the spoon still, and it will hold its shape on the plate. So it kind of plop down on the plate and still keep sort of its pile shape. Still no lumps, and it is not sticky. That's the big one. Think peanut butter. Peanut butter would be kind of this texture, but it's sticky. Therefore, it doesn't count. It's not under this texture. Your fork drip test, it sits on top of the fork. It might kind of dollop a tiny bit through the tines, but not really. It should sit on top of your fork without dripping through. It does leave a clear pattern. If you stuck a fork across the top of it and you remove that fork, you would see the fork lines, the prongs. And it should, again, plop off a spoon in one fell swoop, leaving very little residue. So it should look something more like this. It would plop off. You kind of see at the bottom of the top right one how it has that rounded shape. And it's not leaving a whole lot left on the spoon. You should still kind of be able to see spoon through the residue. Peanut butter here does not count. It plops off, it's kind of that thickness, but it's sticky. It is not a puree texture. Peanut butter is not safe for just about anyone with dysphagia because it's sticky. So side by side, your honey versus your pudding. This is your honey level, it drips through the fork, it doesn't leave a pattern. Your pudding stays on the fork, it does leave a pattern. Thickening basics. Every single bottle of thickener has directions on the side for how much thickener to put per ounces of fluid for whatever thickness you're trying to get to. I also made thickening guides. They are these around the building. They're in like 8 different places. I don't know about you guys, I struggle to do the calculation in my head, so I have done the work for you. All you have to do is find your number of ounces, your consistency, and the number of pumps is right there. This is also on the back. So you guys have your reference, and you have these guides on the bottom, which we'll go over again here. Take advantage of this. I've done the work for you. So always add thickener based on the amount of liquid in the cup, not the size of the cup. If your cup is not completely full, then you're not going to use 12 ounces here because you don't have 12 ounces of liquid. The amount of liquid. Use the Medline cups as much as you can because they have the ounce markings on the side and it makes it easier and it makes it more consistent. Always pour the liquid and then the thickener. You should not ever have a cup that has thickener in it that you're pouring a liquid onto the top of. This especially comes into play when you're doing carbonated liquids. And ice, again, does not belong in thickened liquids. It doesn't. If I see ice in a thickened liquid, I will throw it out immediately. When that ice melts, it thins the drink. If you have someone on a thickened liquid, because they will aspirate on something thinner and the ice is thinning their drink, it's no longer safe for them. Ice does not belong in thickened liquids. Always pre-stir carbonated drinks before you add the thickener. This will prevent it from bubbling up and foaming over and being very uncomfortable for the resident to drink. Once you add the thickener, stir gently. Again, you're trying to minimize that foaming over. Some degree of bubbling is normal. Leave yourself room in the top of your cup for it to bubble a little bit so it's not bubbling over, you don't have a mess. But it shouldn't be excessively bubbling and it shouldn't really continue to bubble further and further up. If it's doing that, you know you didn't pre-stir it enough or you stirred it too roughly once you added the thickener.
I find it much easier to use only 12 ounces of soda at a time to be able to stir that liquid out. And using a straw is not good enough. You have to get a spoon.
Yeah, or a fork.
I've tried to drill that into CNAs for 8 months now.
Yep. Straws do okay if you're thickening like juice or water, whatever it is, where you can get a little bit more aggressive, but carbonated stuff is way, way easier. Simply Thick actually recommends a fork for stirring it all through. But many thickeners, this has improved over the years, but a lot of them still slightly thicken the drink the longer they sit. So if you know a resident has had a thickened drink and you know it's been sitting for a while, replace it because it's probably gradually gotten thicker over time. Replace their straw as well because they get gunked up. And do not put thickener directly down the sink. It gunks it up. It's like putting grease or Vaseline straight down your sink. Don't put the gel directly through the sink. Simply Thick recommends you dilute it 10 times first before you put it down the drain. If you're considering if someone is on a honey thick liquid, that's a lot of thickener in their drink to stick down the drain. So I just don't. I hate throwing away a liquid, but at that point it doesn't really feel like a liquid. Put it in the trash. Don't put it down the drain. Maintenance will thank you later. I wish I had that picture. Wasilla sent out, Wasilla's maintenance had a picture one day of a bunch of thickener down the drain, and it was disgusting, and I wish I still had it, but don't do it. Just keep it out of the drain. Okay.
Especially the soda machine drain.
Especially the soda machine drain. Yes. Keep it out. Just keep it out of drains. Keep it away from all drains, because it will continue to thicken. Again, that thickening agent thickens when it interacts with other liquids down the drain. Alright, so that's our liquids and our thickening basics. We'll go through the solid textures. Starting with level 5, minced and moist. This can be eaten with a fork or a spoon. It could be eaten in chopsticks if they have really, really good hand control. It would take some effort, like rice. You could technically do it with a chopstick if you have good enough control. It should be soft and moist, no separate liquid about it. Small lumps are visible but easy to squash with tongue force alone. You shouldn't have to like force it down. You should be able to mash it to the roof of your mouth with your tongue. Minimal chewing is required, but biting is not. You should not have to bite a piece off of like a bite off of the larger piece. It should be minced down where that's not relevant. Adult pieces of food for minced and moist should be no more than 4 millimeters wide and just over a half an inch long. 4 millimeters wide, conveniently, is about the space between the prongs of a fork. So we'll look at that here. So your fork pressure, it can be easily mashed with very little pressure. If you were to press a fork down, your thumbnail should not turn white. You shouldn't need that much pressure to mash a minced texture. Fork drip, it sits on a pile on top of your fork. It shouldn't fall through, and it holds its shape on a spoon, and it should fall off your spoon if you were to tilt it. You might have to shake just a little bit lightly just because it is a little bit more moist, but it should not take a lot of effort. Like if you give it one little go, it should fall. So there's your size. This is the kind of size we're looking at for minced. It's smaller than I think most people think about. So it's looking for that 4 millimeters, which is the size between the prongs of a fork. That's your reference. Soft and bite-sized is exactly what it sounds like. It is soft food. It's bite-sized food. You can eat it with a fork or a spoon. A knife is not required. It has already been cut down small enough where you shouldn't need a knife to cut it even smaller. Some people still use a knife to help, get things on their other utensils, but you shouldn't need it to cut it down smaller. It should already be small enough. Chewing is required for this, but again, biting is not. It should be cut down small enough where you're not having to bite a piece off in order to get it small enough. Bite-sized pieces as appropriate for size and oral skills. So even if we have an adult but their oral skills are not what they used to be, they need smaller pieces because they need to have less to manage if their oral skills are not what they used to be. So for adults, no larger than 1.5 centimeter pieces is what is recommended. 1.5 centimeters, it's pretty small. It's smaller than what a lot of us cut for ourselves. But again, we're considering that these folks may not have teeth. They may have deficits with their swallow. They need it smaller and they need it softer. So it would squash under your fork, it would break apart. When you remove your fork, it will stay squashed. It should not return to its shape. Using pressure on this one, you do want your thumbnail to turn white. So that one, even if you have to press hard enough where your thumbnail is white, but it still squishes, you are still soft enough. And you should be able to cut it with a spoon or a knife if you were to turn it on the side. Ideally, they don't have to because we should have it small enough at that point, but if they really needed to, or you found a piece that was a little big and you were with the resident, you could cut it really easily with a spoon or a fork. Easy to chew. This is a regular texture. It just sticks with foods that are inherently on the softer side, either because they're already soft to begin with or we prepare them to be softer. It doesn't include anything hard or chewy. Stuff with seeds, husks, bones are not part of an easy to chew texture. We don't do a lot of those textures here often. Like the taco bar has the crunchy chips. That one's a little bit in there. But we prepare a lot of our food to be soft to begin with. We're not out here giving, uncooked baby carrots to residents. We're giving them cooked carrots, so they're already softer. It may include mixed consistency food and liquids if the resident is safe for thin liquids. So think of a soup or a fruit cup where it has the solid and it has the broth or the juice or whatever it is. If the resident is okay for thin, they can have all those things without thickener. And then regular. This is normal, everyday textures. There's absolutely no restriction at this level. No restrictions on texture, no restrictions on size. It has things that are hard, tough, chewy, crispy, crunchy, dry is included here. It can have seeds or husks or bones, and again, it can have that dual consistency stuff. And then we have this weird little one called transitional. You see this along the side on the top of that pyramid diagram, and it's textures that start at one level, but if you apply heat or you apply moisture, it changes to another texture. So it would be easily deformed, it disintegrates, it loses its shape, it becomes soft, it becomes mushy. We have lots of things just in our day-to-day that are transitional textures. Ice chips are transitional texture. Ice cream, cotton candy, wafer cookies or waffle cones that get wet and they get mushy. Crackers are a big one. So we have some residents that want crackers in their soup, and maybe they're not safe for a regular texture, but if you let the oyster crackers sit in their soup, they become soft. That's a transitional texture. Or saltines become soft as soon as you get them wet. And so a lot of cereals, like bran cereals, Special K cereal, they get soft. If you let it sit in milk, they're the ones that are uncomfortable because they become soggy. Those are transitional textures. Okay, those are our textures. That's like your very fast rundown of all of the IDDSSI textures. I wanted to go over assistive devices, even though it's not a texture, just because you guys see this come through on diet slips, and you see these recommendations coming through on communication slips and things like that. And I think we get them mixed up sometimes across the board, or I ask you guys to use something that we haven't been trained on or whatever it is. So I wanted to look at them real quick. You can have all kinds of things that count as assistive devices. Even a straw counts as an assistive device for some residents. If they can't drink from a cup, they can drink through a straw, and that's all it takes for them to be able to drink whatever it is. It counts as an assistive device. ProVal cups, which we have some in, I don't know if we have any in the kitchen, but we have some in the gym. They control the amount that you can take at one time in a sip. Nosy cups, we have them in the gym. If you are unable to tip your head back, they have a little cutout, so you don't have to. You can tip the cup all the way up without having to also put your head back. Safe straws, again, control the amount of liquid you can pull through a straw. It cuts you off with that little metal bead here at the bottom. These are helpful for our folks with dysphagia. We only have a handful, and a lot of them are made for thickened liquids. They're an added safety precaution for thickened liquids. And then lidded cups or cups with handles. Again, if all they need is a handle to be able to drink that counts. Then we have the more specific ones. Weighted utensils in our kitchen, I believe, have the black handles. They're good for people with tremors, or that, they also have a built-up handle, so if they have a large grip, but they have that weight. It's a significant weight. Versus a built-up handle down here, I believe is gray in the kitchen, where they're a little bit heavier, because they have a larger handle, but if you were to hold them next side by side, it doesn't have the added weight that the weighted ones do. We have some hand straps that I stuck in the kitchen just recently. We have a resident using one of these where it just goes around your hand and you can put any utensil into it so that they can still feed themselves without having to grab a utensil. We have angled utensils if you have someone who can't angle it themselves, or their arm is constantly already at an angle. You can use an angled utensil to sort of compensate for it. Now we have a couple rocker knives in the gym as well. So if you had one hand but you wanted to cut a rocker knife, it's much easier. It's less of a saw and more of a rock. We have some in the gym. Then we have plates and bowls that are assistive. So we have partitioned plates. We have a resident who uses one of these. We have plenty of residents that use plate guards to keep food from obviously ending up on the table, or they need something to help them get food onto their utensil. And non-skid placemats. We have like little sheets of Dyson, and it basically just goes under the plate or the bowl, whatever it is, so it's not sliding around the table when the resident is trying to eat. Scoop bowls have a similar effect to plate guards, and suction plates would be similar to having a non-skid plate mat. Okay, quick note from nursing, because this came up from Amber actually today. So before we finish, she had a couple of things that she wanted to just make sure everyone was on the same page about with dining, with actual mealtime dining, because some of our residents need more help getting set up for their meal than others. So when we are delivering their meals, when they're bringing things to the table, that we can keep in mind that they might need a little bit more help just to get started with their meal. We can't just put it in front of them and expect them to be able to figure it out. Not all of them. So unrolling silverware. Some of our residents, especially if we have residents with dementia, they have a silverware roll. They're not gonna necessarily connect that they need to unwrap that. So if we can unwrap that for them and place a napkin or put on a clothing protector, that's helpful. Opening condiments, salt, pepper, as the resident wants them, they cannot do it. Uncovering their drinks, opening straws, putting a straw in their drink if they don't already have one. And hand hygiene, keeping in mind if they want to use the wipes that we have, and when we are passing stuff, because we're passing resident to resident to resident, we are making sure that our hands are clean between residents. We're not going from one resident and doing a bunch of stuff with them and potentially touching a bunch of stuff and then going directly to another resident to give them food. Hand hygiene for us is huge. Yeah, so that's your quick note from nursing about dining and just helping our residents get set up for their meal so that they can have it. They're not sitting there wondering what the heck they're supposed to be doing or unable to get their meal started. So those are things we can help with. Questions? There's your 30-minute crash course on all things IDDSSI and assistive devices and
Thank you, Caitlin.